The final aspect of realism I want to speak with you about is the invention of photography. So I keep alluding to, right? There's no photography yet, right? Well, now there's photography. Photography, really, as a medium, starts to be invented, if you really think about it, back with like the camera obscuras in the Renaissance period. But it really is around the early 1800s, like 1820-ish, that we see photography as we really understand it created. And the man that we thank for this, of course, is Daguerre. So one of the earliest types of photos is called a daguerreotype, and that's why it's called that, because it's Daguerre. So he invented the process of the earliest photographs, right, that are created. And photography just literally means drawing with light, right? Graphos, drawing, photos, light. So photography just literally means to draw with light. And you have to have light to create a photographic exposure. In the earliest days, of course, photography was heavily dependent on technique and materials, and was a clunky, bumpy kind of process, right? You had these giant metal plates, right? Yeah, giant metal or glass plates that were covered with light-sensitive materials like bitumen, different types of metals, right? Silver, and then they would be exposed. And early photographs actually were one-time only exposures, right? There was no way yet to print film, because that's not what it was yet. So again, we won't get too deep into the processes, but again, this is the earliest process that you see, here around 1820-ish, right? When you're looking at like the still life in studio. And why is it a still life? It's a still life because Daguerre wanted objects that weren't going to move. Here's another Daguerre, right? Collection of fossils and shells. Because he understood that movement with these longer exposure times with early photographs, you would get blurring, right, of the image. So this is why you see a lot of still lifes. And again, stuff that wasn't going to move or go anywhere is because, again, of the process of these long exposure times when they were using the light sensitive material on the glass plates or the metal plates to create that singular exposure. Later on, of course, the exposure times will drop. But again, typically, even when you see something like a portrait, like you're seeing here, notice that she's not smiling. So I remember I was teaching a photography class when I was doing my graduate work, and I was showing them all these kind of daguerreotypes that were portraits. And one of the students was like, "Oh, they all look so grim." And I was like, "Well, they're not grim, probably. They just knew they couldn't smile, because if they smiled, they'd have to hold the smile for like 3 to 5 minutes, and that wasn't going to happen. And so they would blur. So what they would actually do is tell them not to smile or emote too much, right? Hold their face placid and still, right? And then they would actually sometimes put the body in braces. So they put your neck in a brace and your waist in a brace. They'd brace your body to minimize movement and minimize any kind of blur that might happen by your body moving, right? So I was jokingly like, they're probably not grim. They're just, again, they knew they couldn't smile. So don't worry, people of the 1800s weren't all grim, right? It's just the process, right, that was being used. Now, Daguerre actually was an interesting guy. He's French, obviously, Daguerre. And he was very interesting because he actually gave the patent for the daguerreotype to the French government because he wanted everybody to have access to photography as a method. So he invented it, but he actually gifted it to the country of France, essentially, so people could do this. And I joke today, you would never see anybody being that charitable, right? You invent an iPhone, you hold on to that patent, right? You take the money. But Daguerre was like, no, the French state should have it. That way people can have access to the photographic process. So he was a really cool dude, and really nice, right? He wanted to have people have access to photography. In the earliest days, as I mentioned, most photographs were of things that weren't going to move. As the exposure time dropped, right, you start to see more portraits. Nadar was very famous for his celebrity portraits, like you see here. And you start to see someone like Edward Muybridge consider the idea of motion through photography. So what he actually did was he actually used tripwire systems so he could take these photographs, right, of things moving, right, through space and time. So as the exposure times dropped, right, they could do more, right, to show different subjects and then show motion as well. And, why do I talk about, and his quote here, by the way, "I am Helios, god of light." He was just a very full of himself kind of guy. Um, But like, why do I talk about, photography and realism? Because think about it. Before this, people couldn't see a picture of something real. They had to look at a painting, which could be a lie. So we take photography for granted, I think. But I also don't think, I also think we understand now that maybe, for them, photographs were a document. I don't think we believe that anymore either. So I joke that photography is kind of morphed and changed because for these people, they looked at a photograph as a real document, a proving something. For instance, in the horse piece by Muybridge here, they really had not understood how a horse galloped. You can go back and look at older paintings of horses running, and oh, it's a mess. Like the horses are all like four legs in the air, just, because people couldn't really, you could observe it with your eyes, but it's so fast, So once Muybridge could take these photographs of each stage of the horse galloping, they were like, oh, there's never a point where the horse's legs are just like straight out in front like that, straight out in front and back, like he's flying through the air. Like that never happens. So people talked about how you could know the truth. And then painters who were going to paint horses now, they were like, well, at least I can paint a horse looking like it's really galloping. No, I'm not lying about this anymore. But this idea of realism applies to photography. They go hand in hand. This idea of let me show you the reality of this thing. But as I mentioned today, I think we'd see a photograph and we maybe not trust it because we know how much photography today gets manipulated. But this was before manipulation was really done. And again, really to think about truly showing you reality, I always show Civil War photographs because I think, what can be more real than showing someone a battlefield? And the quote's great. This is Timothy O'Sullivan, the photographer, and he said, such a picture conveys a useful moral. It shows the blank horror and reality of war in opposition to the pageantry. Here are the dreadful details. Now, pageantry. He's saying if you go back and look at like romantic paintings about war, there's a lot of fluff and pageantry to that. But here, let me show you the dreadful details, which is what a photograph does. This is the truth. This is what happened. This is how people die. So you can look at Civil War photos from this time. And again, another famous one is Matthew Brady, Civil War photographer, and really think about, what they're trying to show you. However, I will tell you that Matthew Brady recently, people started to do research on whether he actually did pose the corpses, which obviously lends a different tone to this discussion. Not just, that he was not taking pictures of real things, but, obviously moving corpses around is sort of unsavory and not really nice either. But again, just thinking about these photographs as documents, right, is very important to consider the idea of being able to show the real. And I always love ending with this Daumier print because think about it. What did the other artists think about photography? The other artists, the painters, the sculptors, people like Daumier, printmakers, right, painters, they thought photography was a fad. Because in this print, you'll notice down below, there's all these photograph shops, right, or photograph studios. And it reminds me of like back when there were internet cafes, So this idea of a fad where something's everywhere, you can't live without it. And then it's like, well, who needs that anymore? Everybody has their own computer or their phone. You don't need an internet cafe anymore. Again, insert trend of time here, right? Where something, is a fad, it wears itself out. So you can tell what Daumier's opinion was of photography. Daumier definitely thought photography was not going to be very important and looked down upon it. He thought it would be a fad. He was like painters and printmakers, we are real artists. Photographers are not. So I wanted to also bring this up because the attitude towards photography very often in the arts is a snotty one and kind of a condescending one. I did my doctorate at the University of New Mexico. It's very famous for its photography program. So I was around a lot of, art historians who were studying photography as their main sort of thrust of their education. And I also was around a lot of photographers who were there in the fine arts program. And they talked a lot about how, first off, there's not a lot of just pure photo programs that are highly elevated. UNM is one of the premier ones. So you go to other art schools and, they don't have a lot of focus on photography. So they said it was very unique to be in a situation where photo was really elevated. But they said they would go to do like a group show somewhere and people would give them crap about being a photographer. Like that was a lower art form. And so I saw firsthand, that people could treat photography like it wasn't really an art. I don't think it's as much a problem today, but I do still see it, you know. So I think photography, from its invention in the early 1800s moving forward, it's always had a long road from this print right forward, kind of saying, no, there's a rightful place for us at the art history table, right, at the fine arts table. Like photography is a fine art. But again, I think it still has to fight for its place, and I definitely wanted to bring that up and make sure you understood that as we move forward and photography kind of gets folded into our discussion. That, you know, sometimes it's difficult for photographers to be given their due, right, as fine artists.